Okay, let me just start off by saying that this is not a video about Catholic supremacy. It isn't about why Catholics are better or more desirable than anyone else. It's about why you should marry someone with the same fundamental beliefs as you and the serious liabilities you invite if you don't. Now, obviously, as a Catholic, I think it's the true religion. That's why I'm Catholic. And we should be able to say that without having to pretend otherwise for fear of offending other people. If you're a Protestant or a Jew or a Muslim or otherwise, it should be because you think that's the true religion or faith or belief system. As a Catholic, I believe there is much that is true in those systems of belief, in those faith traditions, but where they depart company with Catholicism, I think that the Catholic understanding is the correct one. And marriage is one of those things that puts those beliefs to the test because it raises the stakes. If you're living life well, it will be amplified in marriage. If you're living it poorly, same thing. The stakes are huge in marriage, so it's worth planning for and being deliberate about. A successful and happy marriage is a very blessed thing, as I can personally attest to. A failed marriage is personally, psychologically, financially, socially, and spiritually devastating, and not just for you, but for your children and your extended family or your future children as well, which I can also attest to as someone who lived through it as a kid. All the metrics we have tell us that the outcomes for children of divorce are worse. They struggle more in school, they struggle more with mental illness, with substance abuse, they struggle more in their careers, with crime, and they struggle more within their own marriages, repeating the same problems for the next generation. In fact, some studies say that divorce has greater negative consequences for children than the death of a parent does. So it would have to be a recklessly selfish thing to risk all of that for the sake of the reasons that people generally offer to justify marrying someone wisdom says that they probably shouldn't. So let's start off with the first reason I would give for why you shouldn't marry somebody in that scenario, which is that infatuation is just a really bad impulse to make a permanent life-changing decision on. Just because you have extremely strong feelings for someone, and maybe they do for you, it doesn't mean you should act on it in this way. Feelings, especially intense ones, can be deceiving. The ancient Greeks considered this kind of romantic infatuation and intoxication to be a form of mental insanity because people acted so irrationally when they were under its spell. If anything, it's something to guard yourself against. Marriage is about building a life with somebody you know you will be able to trust and depend on long term. It's extremely practical in its implications and therefore requires considerable rational deliberation. The intoxication of infatuation only prevents meaningful rational deliberation. Now, I'm not saying that it's wrong to marry someone you're infatuated with, but that alone is a really bad reason, especially if it's convincing you to marry someone that you have fundamental disagreements with about morality, lifestyle, and the ultimate trajectory of your life. The next reason is because both you and your spouse are going to change a lot. The person you're currently in love with isn't going to be the same person 10, 20 years down the road. But marriage is a promise of permanence. It isn't just about the person you love now, but the person you will be with decades from now. Are you going to want to be with that person then? And I know that people change this way because I'm old enough to have witnessed it. Everyone I know has changed, and it happens in one of two ways. Either they change deliberately or accidentally, but change is inevitable either way. Ironically, the accidental change comes from people who aren't trying to change. They're trying to stay the same, but the experiences of life, the effects of long-term habits, and just the effects of aging transforms us. And if people aren't being deliberate about it, then the kind of person they change into is just like a roll of the dice. This is how people end up with bad personality traits like addictions. They weren't aiming for that, but they also weren't being diligent about it. They thought they could just continue behaving the same way, doing the same thing that they were doing and getting away with in their early 20s indefinitely. And then they turn around one day and they're shocked to find out that those habits have mutated into addictions or serious vices. The deliberate change happens when someone has a vision for who they want to be and how to get there. And if their roadmap for getting there is sound, then they will find success in that, at least some success. Ideally, you and your spouse want to be changing in the deliberate kind of way, and in a way that you both agree to, because you're both going to have to be married to the person that your spouse turns into. And your moral values are that roadmap. But if your spouse is like agnostic, atheist, or just another religion, then you aren't using the same roadmap. If they're relying on the secular ethics of today or just another religion, then the person they turn into is going to be a more amplified version of those values. Because the more you practice a certain way of life, the more it becomes you. Simultaneously, if you're going to practice something like Catholicism, then you'll be moving in the opposite direction of your spouse as they continue moving in theirs. And that's just a recipe for disaster. Either the relationship will suffer as you become strangers to each other, or your moral integrity will suffer as you find yourself compromising your moral integrity so that the relationship doesn't fall apart. And let's be honest, that's not the kind of dilemma someone who loves you should force upon you, but it's exactly what happens when you marry someone with incompatible beliefs to you. The next reason is because raising your children will force compromises on either your relationship or on the well-being of your children. Because your role as a parent is to mentor your children, to shape them into the kind of people you want them to be, the kind of people who can navigate through all the challenges and adversities that this life offers. But if you and your spouse have serious moral disagreements on fundamental questions, this is going to be a constant battle, one that will insist that you compromise on how you raise your children in order to keep peace in the relationship, or where you sacrifice the relationship in order to ensure that your kids get the kind of formation that you know that they need. And raising kids is a constant, never-ending, every minute of everyday exercise in morality. They will test your beliefs and your practice of those beliefs constantly, both through explicit questions. They'll always be asking you about moral scenarios, and by inviting scenarios of their own behavior that force you to make moral judgments about how best to proceed. Kids are just very morally unformed and in some respects inclined towards extreme selfishness and injustice. So you have to constantly correct and teach them. But if you and your spouse disagree about what the correction or the lesson should be in some scenario, you'll end up fighting, or you'll end up avoiding helping your child who is forcing a scenario that requires immediate attention. And again, it's high stakes and high stress, making things that much more challenging. My wife and I are making those kinds of assessments and decisions all of the time. The kids get into fights. The kids ask if they can do something. They ask if they can eat something. They ask if they can stay up late. They ask if they can be friends with so-and-so who you might think is not a great influence. They ask if they can watch a certain movie or TV show. And you have to be vigilant and consistent in your responses, or you will fail in your duty as a parent. And having another parent who is constantly undermining you or just isn't on the same page as you will be a constant source of stress for you. And you will eventually find yourself resenting your spouse. And living like that is not necessary. You don't have to take these kinds of liabilities because you happen to be suffering from puppy love in your 20s. Okay, the next reason is about the ultimate ends of our lives. In our 20s, we're not really thinking about that all that much, but as you get older, you will find yourself constantly, habitually taking an inventory of your life and where it's going, and eventually you'll start thinking about death and of course, what's next? Your religion is going to be the thing that helps you prepare and make sense of that. But if you and your spouse are not on the same page of that question, you will find yourself approaching the most important questions of the meaning of your life in incompatible ways. And that's going to be rough. If you believe in salvation or the afterlife, you may find yourself admitting that your spouse's soul is heading in a different direction from you. This person that you've built your whole life with and somehow managed to survive the perils of everything I just described, only to watch them head towards a spiritual cliff in the last years of your life. Dying and letting go of this life and everything that you've built in this life is going to be hard enough. But as a Catholic, I have hope that it isn't just a tragedy at the end, that God has a plan for us if we accept his rescue plan. We get to experience the fulfillment of everything that we hope for. But your spouse, if they reject that rescue plan, is walking a road to despair. And you'll have to watch them walk it alone or be tempted to walk it with them and lose your own soul in the process. Lastly, if you're a Catholic, you know marriage is a sacrament, and in order to be a valid sacrament, you have to marry someone who is at least baptized. But even with that, there's going to be complications about it being licit. So let's say even you overcome all of that and it's licit and valid. There's still going to be a massive issue, which is openness to life. Because if your spouse is not open to life or intends to use contraception illicitly, then this would strongly jeopardize the validity of the marriage. So let's say you're a Catholic who wants to benefit from the graces of the sacrament, but your betrothed has no intention to honor the consent of the vows of a Catholic wedding. Well, then the sacrament doesn't take place. Furthermore, if they are using contraception or expect you to, then you will be participating in the deliberate frustration of the ends of marriage, which is a grave sin and one you could be trapped in for the duration of your marriage. And this is a big one because how many non-Catholics are going to be willing to entertain the kind of openness to life that the church expects of us? Most baptized Catholics aren't even willing to do that. And that frustration of conjugal relations is also going to frustrate the intimacy that you and your spouse can enjoy, because the intimacy of that bond is an effect of rightly ordered human sexuality. But disordered human sexuality, which is one that is divorced from its teleology, is one that is going to produce disorder in the relationship. And if nothing else, that should be a deal breaker for anyone who intends to live as a faithful Catholic. And if you're Protestant or Christian of another affiliation, I know that prohibitions against contraception seem weird because it's so contrary to just how everybody lives their lives today. But in the scope of Christian history, you're absolutely in the minority if you think contraception is okay. Christian churches were 100% unanimous in their proscriptions against contraception for their entire history, all the way up until the cult of sexuality of the 20th century, which has been disastrous in its effects, if you know anything about that history. And then one by one, all the churches changed their teachings, not because they found some new insight in the Bible, but because the secular world pressured them into embracing its promiscuity, which has led to disease, the breakdown of marriage, and the sterilization of our civilization, such that we aren't even able to replace ourselves anymore. So if you find yourself in this situation, you're in love and your significant other is not of the same religion as you, you should have a serious conversation about these things and explain to them that you intend to practice your faith all the way to the end. And you should talk about all of these big moral questions like sexual morality, raising children in the faith, and the very strong need for them to convert in order for this whole thing to work out. And don't make this mistake. Don't go into marriage using it as a means to evangelize somebody. Don't marry them expecting that they will convert over time because of your love. It's a huge risk that, all things considered, isn't worth it, because it's probably not going to work. And they're just as likely to evangelize you in the opposite direction. How do you know they aren't going into this thing thinking the exact same thing? Because that's kind of a stereotype. It's really typical. Lots of people go into marriage intending to change their spouse into a better version of what they want. And they're not going to be upfront about that, obviously, because then it wouldn't work. At the end of the day, marriage is a huge commitment, and without a commitment to actually align your lives in the most important ways, it's destined for friction, if not failure. Okay, thanks for watching. These videos and this channel are only possible because of viewer support. So if you can spare some help, please consider making a contribution through my website at brianholdsworth.ca, or join my locals community at brianholdsworth.locals.com, where you can interact with myself and other like-minded individuals. We actually just started a monthly Zoom meetup where we're studying some articles of St. Thomas Aquinas in his Summa. So if that's interesting to you, then come join us there. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe.